Okay, hello and welcome everybody to this session. Delighted that you could join us. Forces Shaping Europe, and what a cracking panel we've got for you as well. I'm Ross Westgate, I'm going to moderate the session. And it's an extraordinary time, as always, to be this. Look, since the financial crisis, Europe has been a hot topic across the globe. But we are obviously at a period where only just last week, with the GDP numbers released for the eurozone, have we seen the eurozone finally regain the total output or surpass the peak that it reached in 2008. So that's an indication of just how big an impact the financial crisis has had on the bloc. We will talk about that. We will talk about the political forces at play, the rise of nationalism, the refugee crisis that's putting such a strain on the political processes in Europe, greater Russian aggression, the energy crisis. All these factors are at play. But perhaps the single biggest factor, and the one that it's hard to ignore to begin with, of course, is a vote that's taking place in the UK on June the 23rd, for which the first time since the entry into the common market, the people of Britain will have a vote to decide whether they want to remain within the EU or not. So that will commence our discussion, and to do that, we've got a substantial panel for you. On my right is Jim Mellon, who's a UK investment group, one of the UK's most successful investors, fund managers and entrepreneurs. He's also author of Cracking the Code. I'm sure that's available, Jim, in the bookshop just around the corner.
Oh, I'm sure it
It
is.
is worth taking a look at. On my left is Howard Shaw, who's chairman and founder of Shaw Capital, the UK investment group, who also has offices in Guernsey and Berlin. I'm delighted to say we're joined by Peter Baer, who's member of the German Parliament for the CDU party, and he's also on the Committee for Foreign Affairs at the Bundestag as well. Peter, welcome to you. Thank you so much for joining us. We also are joined by Senator Roger Wicker, who, amongst many of his duties, is on the US Senate Commission for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Senator, delighted that you could join us. Thank you for your time. And finally, but absolutely by no means least, Paul Wolfowitz, the former president of the World Bank, a deputy secretary of defense, and a former US ambassador as well. Paul, thank you so much for joining us. So, gentlemen, let's kick off with the issue that's under vote on June the 23rd, a Brexit vote. Now, it's interesting to note the polls on this are somewhat mixed. We had an ICM poll just after President Obama was speaking on the subject, which suggested that 46% wanted to leave the EU and 43% wanted to remain. There was an Observer poll just over a week ago in which the Remain camp was 1% larger than the Brexit camp. And then there's a Survation survey which suggests that 45% want to stay and 38% want to leave, which is rather a mixed bag of polls. But there is only one that matters. Howard, let's kick off with you. Should the British people be voting to leave Europe?
Yes.
Why?
We're not flat earthers. I know that some of our American friends in the room think that it's in the British interest to stay. But I think they're thinking about American interests, not British interests, when they say that. Why should we leave? Well, first of all, we don't have control of our own sovereignty. Can you imagine some court superseding your Supreme Court and telling you how to make your laws in this country? I can't imagine America putting up with that. Putting that aside, let's talk about the economic arguments. We subsidise Europe by about 8 to 10 billion a year. It's a reasonable amount of money, it's not huge. But of much greater significance is the level of regulation that comes from Europe. I started a small business from scratch, and I can't think of a single friend who's an entrepreneur, who's built a business, who's been successful in the UK. I struggle to think, I don't know whether Jim would agree with me, I struggle to think with anybody who thinks we should stay who's a self-made businessman. So what does that tell you? Well, first of all, entrepreneurs tend to think slightly longer term than large corporates. We know that the average longevity of a CEO of a FTSE company is about 5 years. You know, often entrepreneurs think in terms of decades or generationally. And secondly, we understand how regulation impacts business, and 60% of all regulations that are passed in the UK emanate from Europe. 60%. And we have a slightly more liberal approach.
It doesn't suggest British politicians would be any better at passing good regulation.
I think it's a really important point. If we leave, and I think we'll probably vote to stay, we can come back to that, but if we leave, you need to take advantage of leaving by deregulation. You miss a massive opportunity for Britain to outcompete the rest of Europe if we don't deregulate at the same time. The third reason that we should leave is that immigration is out of control in the UK. Theoretically,
you think that's because of the EU?
No
blaming the EU?
No question, because look, theoretically under EU law, the whole of Poland could stand up and leave tomorrow morning and come and live and work in the UK. Every single EU citizen is entitled to move to any other country and live and work in those other countries as long as there aren't strong criminal justice reasons to preclude those people doing it. Now, the country that's created the most jobs, the most dynamic country in Europe over the last 5 years, in fact, we created more jobs than the rest of the EU put together over the last 5 years, has had, without surprise, the biggest flow of immigrants.
But it's benefited as well from low-paid workers, skilled workers as well.
You've got the economic analysis of whether you benefit or not from a flow of immigration needs to take account of the structure of welfare in Europe. When low-paid people come to the UK, they get a tax credit. So even if they're in work, they get a cheque every week from the government. Secondly, they get free access to our healthcare system, entirely free. They get education for their children, entirely free. They get housing benefit, in many cases, free housing. So when you get low-paid workers taking advantage of social services for free, that puts enormous economic strain on the other taxpayers. If you didn't have free social services and free welfare, then it would be a different equation.
All right. So look, entrepreneurs, it's not good for entrepreneurs. You need to take advantage of leaving to generate regulation that encourages business, and you're right about immigration.
Yeah, Peter, well, can I just say finally on immigration? Because
we'll come back to it.
One final point, because the government has set a target on how many people should be allowed in each year, and we're missing the target by a country mile because you can't control the number who come from the EU, we're not allowing many people in who we want to let in, who could add value to the economy. So we're getting top students who come and study at our top universities, Oxford, Cambridge, Imperial College, etc., get first-class degrees, and we send them home because we've got a target to control immigration and we can't control the number of people coming from the EU. Madness.
Crucially, you said that you didn't think Brexit was going to happen. Peter, can I bring you in? How much do you fear at the moment as a German politician Brexit?
Well, first of all, let me just go back a little bit. David Cameron, the Prime Minister, gave this promise while campaigning. There will be a referendum later, and then he's keeping his promise. Just to start with.
Did he make a mistake? From a political point of view?
I think so.
Yeah.
A politician should never make promises just out of the blue sky, because it's always dangerous in the end because people are asking. You said this and back then. So coming back to your question, I think a clear no. I don't think it's good for Great Britain, and it's not good for the European Union if there will be a Brexit. Interestingly enough, some of the points that Howard you mentioned as a problem are one of the great achievements of the European Union. You mentioned you gave the example that from Poland, all the Polish could go, leave the country and come to the UK, for example. That's one of the great achievements of the European Union: free movement of people, and also free movement of capital, goods, and services. That's one of the best things, that they bring the European Union together. I mean, you in the United States, you're used to this. You cross state borders. And then that brings me to another point. You mentioned you gave the example, Howard, of imagine having something like a Supreme Court that overrules your national courts. That's fine. We have the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg, which is well established, and if you compare this to this country, the United States, you have the United States Supreme Court. So this is something that you know, in some regard, you could compare. So you over here are used to this. So this is also one of the big achievements that on a legal framework, the European Union has developed over the years with a single market, bringing the economies together, and also on a legal level, bringing justice together. So, I wonder why this can be actually be an argument pro-Brexit. And then coming to the economic argument, I always, from a political standpoint, find it dangerous to argue only with, well, you did not, but some do, you know, with only sheer economic figures, and say, you know, we're better off without all the, with less regulation, that 60% coming from the European Union, and it's detrimental for our economy. Just recently, just a couple of days back, actually, there was an OECD, Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, published saying that about 3,000 euros each year would cost about 3,000 euros a year every single Englishman, Englishwoman, if there will be a Brexit. So the study says it is very negative on the income side of each and every citizen of Great Britain.
It's not a, but Europe isn't a, people talk about this in economic terms, but the formation of the EU and the common market was driven by political purposes. It was, you know, it came out of the background, right, of the Second World War. No one ever wanted to face that again after two wars in the first part of the 20th century, ever to face that. So, in a way, this is not about economics at all, is it, James? This is politics.
Well, I take the opposite view, because my argument, I wish there wasn't a referendum, because I think Europe is going to go through a process of turmoil which will result in self-reform at some stage in the next few years, and I'll explain that in a second. But we are having a referendum. You either have to vote yes or no. And my vote is to leave because of economics, and I'll explain that to you. Unfortunately, Europe's worst project, and I don't know if Peter agrees with me or not, is the imposition of the single currency, the 19 countries of the eurozone. Everything else about Europe I applaud. I actually applaud the freedom of movement of people. I'm not so worried about sovereignty, because we all abnegate us or abrogate some of our sovereignty to the United Nations, for instance, or NATO or whatever. But I do think the economic situation in Europe is very, very bad at the moment. Italy, as an example, hasn't grown for 19 years. 40% of young Italians, most of whom, when they're young, live with their parents up to the age of 35 or 40, don't have a job. In Greece, it's 50% of young Greeks don't have jobs. And the reason for that is because the one-size-all monetary policy imposed by the single currency has caused massive distortions in what used to be a balancing regime. So France, if it had trade problems, would devalue its currency, so would Italy on a regular basis. Germany would revalue the Deutschmark. Today, the Deutschmark is estimated to be 18% undervalued, thank you very much. And as a result, Germany runs huge trade surpluses. So if I said to you that this year Germany will have somewhere between 7.5 and 8% of its whole economy as a trade or current account surplus, you might think, well, maybe that's a good thing for Germany. Actually, it's a terrible thing, because those surpluses are a very distorting factor for the rest of Europe. So Germany is basically exporting unemployment to the rest of Europe. The rest of Europe can't rebalance their economies by the normal process of devaluation. And you're looking at, this is not like the United States. It's completely different to the US. The poorest state in the US might be 20% poorer than the richest state. In Europe, you have the richest country with an income that's at least 10 times that of the poorest country. So you've imposed on countries that have very different stages of development, very different cultures, and very different economic levels, a single currency, in my opinion, far too early. So I'm going to be very quick on this. What's the result of that? Well, the result is that France and Italy, the two largest countries or economies in Europe after Germany and the UK, are both in classic debt traps. Their debts are growing, but their nominal GDPs can't grow fast enough to reduce or to even keep the debt at a stable level. And that's despite the fact that interest rates are at record lows. Negative interest rates, by the way, are another disaster. I'm sure you agree on that for the European Union. In fact, Wolfgang Schäuble has said exactly that it's causing political disturbance and massive distortions in Europe. So France and Italy are in a debt trap. And what's going to happen there, and they've got relatively short durations on their debt, and a lot of their debt is owned by foreigners. At some point, people will not believe Mario Draghi anymore. I'll do whatever it takes to maintain, to keep the euro together. And the bond markets will take flight, interest rates on French and Italian debt will rise, and I don't know when that's going to happen. I would say in the next 3 to 5 years, and there'll be a monumental crisis in the eurozone. And I think at that point, the eurozone will disintegrate. They will have to be reformed into 2 blocks or several blocks, just to reflect the divergent economies. When that happens, Britain is better in a comfortably appointed lifeboat sitting in the English Channel than on the Euro Titanic as it goes down, because it will cause a depression, it will cause international ruckus. And it's surprising that this is the main issue in world economics at the moment, but this is not a particularly brilliantly attended seminar, when it's one of the key points of the next few years is what happens to Europe. As it is at the moment, Europe cannot grow its way out of its problems. It just can't grow its way out of its problems. Unemployment will remain persistently high.
Just had the best quarter, last quarter of growth is better than the UK and the US.
Yeah, but I mean, overall this year, it'll be lucky to grow at 1%. The UK will probably grow just by under 2%, and the US will be around 2%. Quarters really don't matter. But the point is, there isn't sufficient momentum to get Europe out of its malaise. And there's not enough restructuring in Italy and France.
If there was... So your view is actually Brexit doesn't matter, because in 3 to 5 years, there is going to be a resurgence of a bond market attack on the debt of Italy or France, or there will be some trigger.
I think Brexit matters because we're better off outside when all this is happening. All right. In addition,
but it's not the single biggest risk facing the eurozone. It's not Brexit. It is actually the eurozone or the EU. It is a eurozone breakup.
100%. And just to very quickly counter one of Peter's arguments, that this is going to cost every household in the UK, which is per household, not per individual, according to the OECD. The OECD was one of the organisations that said that Britain had to join the euro, otherwise there's going to be dire economic consequences. All those people who said we had to join the euro, which has been our saving grace that we didn't, are the ones who are saying we have to stay in the European Union. Now, Europe is a customs union, all right? So there's free trade between all the European countries. There's no tariffs. But Europe imposes tariffs on the rest of the world. So if we want to import dairy products from New Zealand or Australia, there's a 50% tariff. If we want to import cereals from America, which are a much more efficient producer than the Europeans are, we have a 28% tariff. There's an 11% tariff on clothing. Overall, that adds a cost of living priced, if you want, to the British, who are very heavy importers of food, and all their clothing more or less is imported, of about 10% per household. Just on that one point, the protectionist barriers that are levied by the European Union. Forget about the transfer of money to Europe and all that sort of stuff, which is trivial. It's about 0.5% of GDP. I think there's a good case for Britain to leave, but it's a nuanced argument. There are also good cases for us to stay. Okay. On balance, I would say leave.
Okay, Peter, just let's come back to the point Jim's made about Europe. The eurozone is going to come under attack again. And look, we know that the single currency is suboptimal because, yes, there is a central bank, but there is no central treasury. So is the end of the project, as Jean-Claude Trichet has told me many times, actually we have to have a federal Europe? That's the only thing that's going to prevent what Jim is talking about happening.
Well, now we're back in the political dimension, because I agree that there are a lot of challenges, and they have to do with the flaws in the birth of the European Union. When you were mentioning, you're giving the single currency, the euro, as an example that is not working, and many things were not taken into account when creating this. But I think it's too easy just to say, okay, we're better off without it, and so let's leave this club. We're not actually struggling to make this better. So from my personal perspective, being a EU citizen and also being a politician, is let's do and try to make it better. I think leaving the others alone, you can fix it. So all these troubles, the immigrant crisis, the Greece crisis, the financial things, and all these things. I think it's, well, speaking of solidarity, I think it's not good to have. If you look back in the past, the Brits had always negotiated lots of opting outs So I think if you really believe, and you were mentioning earlier, the beginnings of the European Union, why it was created, and so just after the Second World War, it was a political project. Yes, right in the beginning, yes, and it's still the political dimension still plays a big role because it needs political leadership and decisions to make this thing better, more democratic legitimization, for example, and to fix the flaws of.
So there is a democratic deficit in Europe.
I think so.
But to make the single currency work, do the people of Germany believe? Will they be given a chance to believe that, say, the end of this project is a common treasury within Europe? Do you see that happening, and in what time span? Because that would be the one thing, perhaps, that Jim's talking about would prevent that happening.
Well, in the end, I think you have to admit that you have to transfer a lot more sovereignty from the national parliaments, from the governments, to Brussels, for example, or wherever the capital would be. Because without making this last final step towards a federation of European states, then the flaws will still be in place. So from my perspective, thinking it to the end, I don't know when. I mean, we're asking me about a time, 20 years, 30 years, I don't know. We will have to have it.
Peter's actually saying something quite extraordinary. I wish he was on television on the Brexit debate, because if he said that on national TV, the outvote would be at least 60-65% in favour of leaving. If they said, well, in 10, 20,
Why
30
are you so
years,
afraid
we're
of the
going to have
European
a
Union,
federal
Howard?
Europe. I mean, my God, do you think the British people really want that? They voted, actually, just a small correction, we did have a referendum. We did have one more previous referendum on staying in Europe in 1975. When we voted on that, we came in 73, we were told it was a free trade zone.
Common market. Yeah.
It was a common market. And we were persuaded to stay because we were told we were better off in than out in a common market, which was true at the time. Britain benefited a lot from coming in to that common market. It's inconceivable, by the way, when we talk about these OECD studies, it's all premised on the fact that terms of trade for Britain would be inferior if we left than if we stayed. I mean, this is the biggest load of nonsense I've ever heard in my life. You know, the facts are that we have a trade deficit with Germany of close to between 30 and 40 billion a year. Are you seriously telling me if we vote out in a month's time that you're going to turn around and say, okay, we're going to shut down trade with the UK, you're going to trade with EU on worse terms, and then we're not going to take your financial services, we'll say we won't take your cars. It's a nonsense. We will carry on. We will carry on trading. We will carry on trading. We will carry. I'm sorry?
It comes as a higher price for you.
Maybe
Because
what price?
4% under WTO rules.
What price? What price? What price?
Because you won't be a member of the single market.
Of course we will. You're going to say to us, we've got a 50 billion a year trade deficit with Europe. You're really going to say we're going to throw you out the single market? This is just nonsense. It's inconceivable.
I just want to bring in Paul and Roger have been sitting very patiently over there, listening to this little inter-European debate that we're having. From where you sit,
We're just waiting to be told it's none of our business.
Well, yeah. Well,
I was coming on to
I
that.
have to say, when
We're at the end of the queue, that's for sure.
When President Obama spoke, the Brexit vote went up. So there was an impact on that. That is whichever way you read that is a fact. Do you see Europe is in a stage, and the financial crisis exacerbated, of an incomplete development that Peter has admitted here, that actually the end of the road is a federal Europe. Do you see that happening? You are in a federal United. Yeah, you're in a federal United States. Do you see a federal Europe that would help solve some of these intractable economic problems?
If I were a European, I certainly wouldn't want that. But let me say, I'm here as someone who attends OSCE Parliamentary Assembly meetings at least twice a year. I'm chairman of a committee at the OSCE, and I'm happy to talk about Brexit if I can stipulate that forces shaping Europe. I list Brexit down as about fourth or fifth in importance. I don't hear us at parliamentary assembly meetings talking about the governance of the European Union going forward. I hear my fellow parliamentarians at the OSCE talking about migration, about the demographic problem that is going to be exacerbated by this flood of North Africans, this flood of Afghans and of Syrians. I hear them talking every time we meet about a resurgent Russia. So I'm happy to talk about.
There is a question there, though, because if the poor economic performance of the eurozone is causing long-term youth unemployment, 50% in Greece, 40% in Spain, 30-odd% in Italy. We are seeing a rise of a nationalistic politics. Marine Le Pen in France, in Austria. It is when you are economically underperforming. We're at a point in the political world where there is a rise to the wings of the political spectrum. So, is the economics the suboptimal currency unit, is the economics having an impact on the politics?
I really don't think it has anything to do with how the EU is governed. We have terrible economic growth.
I'm not saying it's about governance, it's about the economic
terrible
performance.
Economic growth in this country. It's the slowest recovery from a recession
Still an awful lot better than
we've had in a long time. And I think it's because we're overregulated and we have a poor tax system and we haven't done the things necessary to create growth and entrepreneurship and these small business people that normally would bring us out of a recession. I do want to make one point about what Jim said. Because I was sitting here thinking about a British playwright named Shakespeare. And in the play Hamlet, he was contemplating suicide. And he asked himself, to be or not to be, that is the question. And toward the end of the soliloquy, he said, we rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. I think what Jim is saying is probably Brexit will fail. Of course, at the end of the play, Hamlet ended up dying anyway. So I think that there's a parallel there, Jim, with what you're saying.
Well, you mean Brexit will fail in the sense that we won't leave the European Union?
You won't leave the European Union, but it will all fall apart. Or at least
which is why,
Senator,
I wish that there wasn't a referendum, because I think that all it's doing is causing, and actually, I'm not sure I agree with Howard on this. I think post us leaving, the whole federalist project will make damn sure that no one else leaves and will seek to, in some ways, punish Great Britain. I don't know how they're going to do it, but there'll be something that they can do. And that will not necessarily be on the positive side for Brexit.
Jim, it's an easy solution. You know, we'll just say the 10 billion a year, we'll carry on paying it for the next 10 years. But these are our terms for leaving. We've got the trade deficit, we've got the fiscal subsidy. It's bad for everybody. It's a bit like a nuclear war where everybody presses the button. They can threaten all they like that they're going to sort of give us a punishment beating if we leave. But the reality is that won't happen.
Yeah. Well, you both admit you don't think the vote will take place anyway. Paul, you've been very patient. Just what are your thoughts?
I guess first thought is I don't want to join Peter Beyer and Barack Obama as poster boy for the Brexit vote. And I do think that undoubtedly there's some reaction among people in the UK if they hear foreigners saying you should stay in for our sake. But I would say in thinking about forces shaping Europe, I with Roger would put Brexit way down on the list. I would start with the fact that the whole post-Cold War security system is being destabilized. The commitment by both the United States and the UK and Russia to the territorial integrity of Ukraine and its independence is completely trashed now. You have a kleptocratic thug running Russia and encroaching on the principle of ethnic self-determination, which would destabilize a third of Europe, if not the whole continent. You have this flood of refugees, which I think was correctly described by the Supreme Allied Commander as weaponizing the refugee problem. And you have the ISIS problem, which is not confined to Brussels by any means. Britain has certainly had its share of homegrown and imported terrorists. And it seems to me the most important questions facing Europe today are how to deal with some core security issues. And
Is security an EU? Is that an EU issue, or is security actually an intergovernmental and NATO?
I would say the most
Deal.
important institution for addressing security is NATO. And the EU has also unfortunately kind of failed in that dimension. I think there were grandiose ambitions that the EU could somehow substitute for NATO. I think the best it's been able to do at times is to supplement NATO. But I do think that Britain's role in NATO, Britain's role as a kind of bridge between the United States and Europe has been a key factor in European security. And not just European security, but world security as a whole. I know, and now I'm self-consciously speaking as an American, I believe that's good for the United States. I also think it's good for the UK because it contributes to security that the UK benefits from. And I think it gives the UK a certain important position between the US and Europe where precisely...
But I presume that wouldn't change anyway. Britain would retain its seat on the UN Security Council, NATO would still stay intact.
But I think Britain's voice in Europe would be considerably diminished.
I pick up on, because what the Brexit camp have jumped on and what nationalistic politicians have jumped on around Europe is the immigration and refugee crisis, and they've been able to sort of migration, immigration, blend the two together. What are the solutions? And this is very complex, right? But it's undoubtedly having an impact on the politics. So what is the right way to deal with the refugee crisis at the moment that is currently hitting Britain, and which Germany, Peter will know very well, have taken in like more refugees than any other country in Europe. But it is having an impact on the politics. We are seeing a rise of nationalism. So what is the right way to deal with this? Is a international problem that needs to be good, but what are the right systems in Europe that Europe needs to deal with? How do they work together?
I do think that dealing with the refugee problem begins at the source. There was a huge refugee problem 25 years ago when the Kurds fled Iraq and were pushing into Turkey, and there were, I think, 2 million Kurdish refugees on the Turkish border. And the then president of Turkey, Turgut Özal, said to President Bush, either you go into Iraq or I'm going in. So the US went in with a quasi-NATO force, UK, French, Italian, Spanish, and Americans, cleared out northern Iraq, and it transformed that part of the country. Even to this day, it's benefiting from it. And 2 million refugees went home. Admittedly, this is more than the present administration in Washington is even willing to think about. But I think it's something that Europeans need to think about, and it's certainly, it's a much more complicated problem now that the Russians have intervened in the way that they have. But maybe they need to be made part of the solution there as well.
Peter, your country is feeling the impact as well. Is this the government? This has to be government-led initiative working with the rest of the international community, rather than EU, Brussels.
First of all, you were mentioning initially the impact on politics all over Europe. You were mentioning Front National in France, for example. This is only one example. We have the so-called alternative for Deutschland, AfD, in Germany, right-wing populist party. Look to Hungary, look to Poland, look to Belgium, look to England. So we have all over Europe these right-wing nationalist populist party movements getting very strong, not only because of the refugee crisis, but because of the effect of globalization, so to speak. But just as a remark, coming to the refugee crisis, where it's a multi-layer problem, on a European level, the heads of states, foremost the Chancellor, Angela Merkel, is striving for a European solution, which is
there a European solution?
So far, it's they're working on it. But we have 28 member states in the European Union, and only out of those 28, only very few are actually supporting this process, that we need a European Union allocation of those who are knocking on the European Union door, allocation relatively to the strength and to the population of the member countries, which is not happening. You mentioned that we In Germany alone, last year, we took over 1 million people coming to us. So you know about this deal between the European Union and Turkey, which needed to be done, which is starting to work with the so-called hotspots, which are registration sites in Italy, in some of the islands in the Aegean Sea. And actually, it's also a maritime part there, where there are vessels between the Aegean Islands. They're cruising the Aegean Sea and the coast of Turkey. But again, multi-layer. European Union needs to find a solution to allocate those who are coming to us. We need a stronger control of our external borders. There are proposals on the table, but they need to.
Two thoughts for what you say. Sorry, do you want to?
Just the other layers on a national level. In Germany, we have passed several laws last year and the beginning of this year through the parliament, trying to cope with the situation, to manage this, and to finally structure, organize, and reduce the numbers of people who are actually coming to us and who have a perspective actually to stay in Germany. That has been done, but we were completely unprepared, as was the international community. I mean, the international community, and this is the next layer, the highest layer, so to speak. We're basically watching for 4 or 5 years that something is coming. And nobody really was prepared, believed that people are starting to move by the millions out of the regions where the hot conflicts, the war is going on. And I was in December in Iraq, in Baghdad, and in northern Iraq, in Erbil, where the Kurds are, not far from the ISIS front line. And I was also visiting some of these refugee camps and talking to family fathers there. And they were from Mosul, a destroyed city. And they don't want to start moving. They want a perspective back home. They want stability, security, and they want to rebuild their houses, their cities, their homes. But as long as there's a war going on and it's dangerous, they don't have a perspective there. So the international community needs to push up their efforts to really to bring stability there at the same on a military level, at the same time leading diplomatic and political talks. So it's a really complicated thing. And one last thing there, Paul Wolfowitz quite rightly mentioned, we have to go to the source of the problems. So it's good politics of the United States, of the European Union, of everybody to do this, to spend more money on development in these countries. In Africa, for example, we see a lot of people. There's almost starting to move north, and I could talk on this topic for hours.
Just one thing: does this issue of refugee crisis and migration, is it putting at threat one of the very foundations of what you described earlier as one of the biggest successes of the EU, which is the free movement of peoples? How much under threat is this crisis putting on that?
I wouldn't say a threat, but it's definitely a big challenge, one of the biggest challenges maybe after the Second World War. Because again, the member states and the European Union was, and to some extent still is, not prepared to these massive amounts of people who want to come to the European Union. And it's absolutely a very, very big challenge. And that's why we need leadership here. And, we need to have, the heads of state needs to sit together in Brussels or elsewhere and find solution. And it's coming to the Brexit now. It's for me, it's just too simple to say, I'm going off it.
Well, can I say a couple of points on that? I mean, first of all, let's be honest about it, Peter. Angela Merkel didn't consult her European partners when she made the statement, everybody's welcome. She just said it. And, to turn around and say, well, everybody else should take their fair share, she made that statement without consultation.
But that was a myth. It was a public request from the Austrian government. Okay. It's a myth that most people believe in because she said it on TV. But most of my
German, we do a lot of business in Germany. I mean, it was interesting when this first came along a year ago or so. Most of the German population, or certainly the well-educated elements of the population, were really supportive of what Angela Merkel said. That's changed dramatically because there's a strong realization amongst the German population that most of the migrants who are coming are economic migrants. They're not political refugees, they're economic migrants. Of course, people are going to want to come from North Africa to come and access a better life in Germany or Scandinavia. I would if I were them. The question is, with social welfare available, is that what the European people want, and is it something they're prepared to pay for? Then we go to talk about the root of the crisis. I'm not suggesting for a minute this wouldn't have been a crisis anyway, but American leadership or lack of leadership and the policy of the American government, the current American government, has led to a disaster in the Middle East. When Hillary Clinton and President Obama stuck up their hands and said, Mubarak, you're out. He was America's friend for 30 years, and overnight they said, you're out. And what a disaster.
Senator?
So,
pains me to agree with that, but I have to agree. And not only that, this Syria crisis is a large cause of the immigration and refugee crisis, and with all the refugee camps and then the migration into Europe, other people got the idea we better get in on this too. North Africa, Afghanistan. They're worried if we're there for the long term to keep Afghanistan from folding again. My government, the leadership of the United States of America, that I did not vote to put into office, but we've made a decision to allow the main cause of civilian casualties and civilian fatalities in Syria to continue, and that's the barrel bombing by the Air Force of Bashar al-Assad. That's where the deaths have come in, much more so than from ISIS. We won't declare war. The collective West, the collective NATO, will not decide that we should take Assad out. And so, yes, we're largely responsible by poor foreign policy.
That's also complicated by a Russian relation.
It is complicated, and thank you for allowing me to say this, because I don't know how many more chances I'm going to get to talk in this bunch of. What happens in Ukraine over the next 2 years, to me, is far more significant than what happens in Britain over the next 2 months in terms of a Brexit vote. If the collective will of NATO and the United States and the West would be that we're going to do what we have to do to make sure Ukraine succeeds and is able to move toward integration with Europe if they want to, and I think they want to, then I think that's far more of a defeat for what Putin is trying to do, not only in Ukraine, but in Georgia, and we don't know what will be next. Will it be Transnistria? And we frankly don't know what's going to happen.
That's half the country, half of Ukraine might want that. That's the problem. And also, from Russia's perspective, Ukraine is on their border. It's a bit like Mexico to the United States.
I would challenge the percentage you have there. It's not half of Ukraine. The vast majority of Ukrainians want to integrate with the EU. They want to be part of Europe. They want to be part of the West. And they're afraid of Putin because of what he's done. And I will just say again, to me, when you're talking about forces shaping Europe and forces threatening Europe, this is a far more important fight to win than how Europe is governed through the EU over the next few years.
Well, apart from that, except though if Jim is right, because if there is a collapse of the euro area, then that actually probably go to the heart of everything, I would imagine. No?
Well, of course, I still believe in NATO, and that allows me to say that the NATO nations need to look at the situation. Yeah. They need to wonder what a NATO that was strong and resolute in North Africa and in Syria and in other parts of the country would have done to prevent this slide, and maybe they should rethink, and I would urge them to rethink the 2% commitment of GDP that NATO nations are supposed to make towards security.
Peter, Germany's such a, Eastern Europe particularly, and in Germany, massive reliance on energy supplies that come from Russia. Where do how big a threat is that? How much of a sort of political problem is that?
Well, it certainly is an issue. If you just stick for a moment just to Germany, we are dependent for about a third of our imports of gas and oil comes from Russia. If you go farther east, they're almost sometimes even up to 100% dependent on this. So this is obviously an issue. If you look to where our ministers and even the chancellor travels, to various countries, looking to diversify the sources of energy on the globe, and Canada or the United States, where the European Union, especially Germany, is very interested in LNG gas. Although in Germany we don't have a terminal for that. They think the next one is in Rotterdam. So there's already a lot of going on when it comes to diversification of the risks. But this will not change overnight. I'm quite a lot of times visiting the states of former Yugoslavia, Kosovo, Serbia, and Montenegro, and Albania. I was just recently there. And there, all these countries are very dependent, heavily dependent on Russia, not only with regard to oil and gas, but economically in whole. But they want to, they're on the path west. They want to them, still the European models, the EU model seems to be attractive. Obviously on, transfer money and all these things, but also they are somewhat afraid that they are so dependent that there's such a big impact on politics that the incumbent politicians, they just can't help, even tightening the bonds back to Moscow. If you go a little bit back in time, when the sanctions were imposed, the EU sanctions imposed on Moscow, it was that some of these former Yugoslavian states, they supported the EU sanctions, still supporting, like Montenegro. It's a small, very small country with less than 1 million citizens. But anyway, at the same time, Putin flew into in Belgrade and visiting Alexander Vučić there, the prime minister, and offering them a deal, basically putting some economic pressure. If you go with the European Union, if you side with them, then it's going to be tough for you, because he knows they are dependent on economically on Moscow.
And what did they do anyway?
Pardon?
Serbia decided nonetheless they want to be part of Europe.
Absolutely, they're at the front. They're already in the middle of the negotiations. They're opening the chapters in the accession talks with the European Union. So they're very pro-European. It's tough on them to get the balance right, while knowing that they're economically so much dependent on Russia, while at the same time trying to fulfill European standards. So it's tough for them, and we try to support them.
What's the right response for Paul to Europe and the West to Russia?
Sorry, say that again.
What's the right response? What's the right tactic for dealing with Putin?
I think passivity is certainly not the right response. I think Putin is literally getting away with murder in Ukraine. And the risk is it doesn't stop with Ukraine, but it extends possibly to Lithuania and other Baltic countries which have large Russian minorities and which are NATO members. And that begins to bring into question the most fundamental security commitments by the US and by the major European countries. So I think the fact that Putin has encountered very little risk in what he's done so far is something to worry about a lot. I do think the most important thing is to try to strengthen Ukraine politically and economically. But I also believe that giving them better weaponry with which to impose costs on the Russians for what they're doing, I believe, should be part of any package.
I just want to bring in one other area, because we had the, and it's interesting where the politics are going. I mean, particularly when you look at the current presidential race, when you look at the rise of the parties that you've talked about, has globalization at the moment come to a point where we're pausing? We had Greenpeace, releasing the latest report on the TTIP, Transatlantic Trade and Investment Pact, which is trying to paint the picture to the Europeans that they will loosen both environmental and consumer protections. And I'm just wondering, and politicians in the United States are saying this nominally, they're actually looking about America withdrawing from the world. Is one of the greatest potential problems or forces that is going to face Europe and actually the entire world, is that actually there is an overreaching that people are now pulling back from, say, actually globalization doesn't suit us, the economics aren't working. I mean, you're not negotiating TTIP, are you?
No, but I'm heavily supporting it.
Yeah. So are we, has the EU overreached itself? Are we overreaching ourselves? Or is globalization under threat?
The people are afraid because it gets, the world is closing in, so this is growing together, but at the same time, we are at the Brexit discussion, like a reflex, as a response to more globalization, to more technology being available to almost to everybody. People at the same time, I think, feeling they're afraid because they do not really know what they get, where all this is leading to. And they don't have the trust in the political leaders of the world. I mean, somebody, I think it was Howard, quite rightly said that there's not so much faith and trust and support for the chancellor in Germany, because people are, I think, in this extremely complex world, it becomes more and more difficult to intellectually digest it for the political leaders and for the guy on the street, and then for those who are in the position to have to communicate, to explain it to the public. It gets more and more difficult. Yes, I think the globalization is, this is not only multi-layer. There's so many aspects, and you mentioned TTIP. I just visited the panel or the conversation with the U.S. Trade Representative Mike Froman, who I've met last week in Hanover many times before. There was this leak by Greenpeace of some of the secret documents, negotiation documents from the U.S. side. So I don't know. This does not help in the process. But from a geostrategic standpoint, I think it's worth the effort to strive for a very good negotiation agreement.
We've got time just to take a few questions from the room. It's been a great debate. This lady at the back. Thanks. Yep, sorry, just here at the back.
Thank you. Very, very interesting discussion. Okay. Yeah. Thanks. But I just would like to make one comment and then a question. So the idea that the founding of what was then the European Economic Community was a political idea or experiment is not quite true, because if you recall, the foundation institution was the European Coal and Steel Community, which had as its whole aim the pooling of coal and steel resources of France and Germany. And that was obviously brought about to prevent the kind of wars that had always had their origins.
You're not using economics for political purposes, though. That would be
exactly.
That would be the point.
The result was economic, but it was a political vision, so to speak, a political project to put this in place. So I totally agree.
Right, but it would not have worked if it were purely political. It had to appeal to the economic interests of both countries. That was the whole idea. So my question is, isn't there some concern that a Brexit would erode that economic interdependence that has always been the centerpiece of the European Union from its very foundation? And to make one other comment, the OECD did a study a few years ago that looked at how regulated its various members were. In the UK, it found it was actually much less commercial concerns were much less regulated in the UK than Australia, the US, and Canada, along with many other EU members. Thanks.
Well, can I just tip in on that? I mean, I don't know about the study about the regulations. I haven't seen how they came to that conclusion, but I think there's a misconception around that if there's a Brexit vote, somehow or other, trade within Europe is adversely affected. I genuinely believe that this is a complete misconception. We know that Norway and Switzerland have acceded to the EU with conditions into the free trade area. But I believe that if Britain leaves, and once again I'll say that I don't think we're likely to, but if the vote is close, the issue can come back again, and that's why I think it's relevant. I think if we leave, there'll be a British option, not a Norwegian option, not a Swiss option. First of all, it's completely different if you leave than an accession discussion, because if I'm negotiating to join the EU, there's hundreds of millions of people, I'm a small country, and I want to be allowed in. I'm going to have to make concessions to be allowed in. So if I'm Norway, and I'm quite wealthy, I want to sort of join that free trade club, I might give you X, Y, and Z. The reality is, if Britain leaves, there's an interdependence. It's no more in Europe's interests that things are destabilised than Britain's interests. In fact, I would argue that if there were a Brexit, in the short term, it could adversely affect Europe more than the UK. And the Europeans are aware of that. So the idea that if we were vote to leave, that the European politicians would get together and say, well, Britain can't continue to trade on exactly the same terms as before, is just, in my view, completely unrealistic. And therefore, I don't think there's anything to fear economically, trade-wise, if Britain leaves.
Yeah. Well, just to talk about regulations, okay, so the Commission issues directives, they're called acquis. And those directives, there's not been one ever, as far as I'm aware, that's been reversed. So they're not laws that can be changed from Parliament to Parliament, they just go into law. And there's 12,500 of them, and all of them apply to the UK. Now, as you know, having been to London many times, I guess, or Britain many times, the British are a very law-abiding nation. So if there's regulations, we abide by them. It doesn't apply to all other European countries, and I'm not going to name any of them, but I will say that, for instance, Germany has run a trade surplus, a current account surplus, this is true, Peter, for 5 years in a row at about 8%. And there is a ruling by the European Commission that if you run a trade surplus of 6% for more than 3 years, you have sanctions. And no sanctions have been imposed. In fact, nothing has been said to Germany, because the regulations largely emanate from the wishes of the German manufacturers. And we have a very successful entrepreneur in the UK called James Dyson, who is another one of the self-made people. And you probably all have a Dyson, or you know what a Dyson thing is. Hoover. Well, Hoover's the wrong word. A Dyson. Vacuum cleaner.
Vacuum.
And he says that he could double the suction or double the performance of his vacuum cleaners, but the German competitors, Miele, or however you pronounce Miele, have made the regulations such that he can't improve his products, as an example of the regulatory burden that's imposed on Great Britain. So there are lots of regulations that could be taken away, but I think there's many other economic points that can be made in favour. But I kind of agree with you. I think that the original intention was coal and steel. It wasn't, I mean, Jean Monnet had a kind of long-term vision for Europe, but it wasn't about a political union. And in fact, when Britain joined in 1973, we didn't join a political union. And before we joined, we were turned down twice by President de Gaulle because he wanted to put in place the common agricultural policy for the direct benefit of French farmers. So he didn't have a pan-European vision. He had a very much a French interest vision.
No, quick question.
There are
Nope.
There are about 262 treaties that make up trade within the European Union. And because of the trade deficit that the UK has, about 250 of those are actually stacked in Europe, continental Europe's favor, and only 12 in favor of Britain. So in the event of Brexit, I think it would be very difficult to see that Britain couldn't negotiate as good a deal as it has today, trading 250 treaties for 12. So that's one point. The other point, if we take the transatlantic treaty, that is a treaty which I believe Britain could sign up to as it is today. The reason it hasn't been signed up is largely because of French and German agri-subsidies. Also to do with the protection of certain industries, where, again, continental Europe has a lot of issues. So about 4% of US trade make up this category, but about 20 to 25% continental European trade. And lastly, US has asked for a legal framework which could be rolled out across Europe for dispute resolution, which is very similar to the British model. So the point here is, yes, the EU was founded on as a commercial idea within a political framework. And yes, that is much better for Europe if it can go along in that fashion.
Okay.
But in terms of Britain's future, I think in or outside the EU, it will do very well.
Okay, thank you for that. We've just about run out of time, and leaves me to say thank you very much to the panel, to Peter Mayer, to Jim Mellon, to Howard Shaw, to Senator Wicker, and to you, Paul Wolfowitz, as well. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.